visiting researcher at our lab here. Every here for free. So John,
yeah, okay. Let's move to the first one. This is the general outline of the talk. I'm going to start off talking about complexity and what it means. Then I'm going to move on to talk about organization, and then finally about emergence. And on the way, I'll be talking about hierarchies. This is all pretty theoretical. That's what I do. I'm an analytic philosopher. I analyze things. First of all, defining complexity. There are a lot of people who argue that complexity is an observer-dependent thing. There's some truth to that, in the sense that what we observe will, and what scale we observe it at, will give us different values of complexity. But that doesn't mean that there isn't intrinsic complexity within the systems. The observer dependence depends to some extent on scale dependency. Also, there's a confusion. There tends to be a confusion between complicated and complex. Complex systems are usually discussed in terms of complex organization. We'll get to that later on when I discuss organization. There are mathematical notions, and eventually, I guess I'll get to complex organization. It's prevalent in systems theory in particular, this idea that complexity is an observer-dependent thing. A lot of systems theorists go further than that and say we don't observe things, we only study the models that we have of things. Although it does, to my mind, to have a model of something without there being something that's being modeled doesn't really make sense. I mean, we interact with things. We don't interact with models. We may think with models, but we don't interact with models. So there are some theories that are going to be better than others, even if all of our theories are models. And they're useful because of simplifying assumptions that make them tractable, but they're also useful because they're accurate. And there's a bit of a tension between the two. It's nice to have simple models, but simple models tend to be inaccurate, especially when we're dealing with complex things. So there's some truth to the observer dependence notion, which is we choose our models depending on what our pragmatic values are. And we should be aware of this. What is a model? Well, I like Robert Rosen's modeling relation. It comes from Hertz originally. The basic idea is that we have a natural, including a man-made system like a social system or a economic system, that we want to model. And this will have some causal structure. And then a model is a set of logical relations, and often called a structure in logic. Models in logic are just things that have a structure. Now, the natural system is going to have a causal structure. So an accurate model is going to be accurate in as much as its logical structure maps the causal structure of the intended systems. Maybe incompletely, or maybe only in some respects. but nonetheless there will be a correspondence between the two. And the nice thing about this way of thinking about the structure of the nature of the world is that, that we have the same sort of thing, a structure, in our minds and in the world that we're trying to model. And in fact, in other places I've written about a book we have called Everything Must Go. We argue for structuralism. We say the world is actually made up of structures. And consequently, we can comprehend the world completely because, in principle anyway, or any part of it, because we use exactly the same sort of thing to set up our theories as to what is the nature of the world, namely structures. Yeah, as I said, there's a sense in which we can only work with models, but this has been overemphasized. One thing, the world can surprise us, and if all we had were the models in our head to work with, then the world wouldn't surprise us. There must be something out there that's coming in that contradicts our models. So there's more than our models out there. I'm going into this this business of the nature of the observer and the observed to some extent because the view is so widespread that all we can really work with is our models. But that's not true. We interact with the world and the world can surprise us. And also this idea that the world can't really be understood by us because the world's a different sort of thing than what our thinking is. What I'm saying is our thinking has the same nature as the nature of the world. Okay, a couple of things on scale dependency. This is something that is observer dependent. We focus on a particular scale, and this is going to be dependent on our interests. Also, things can be simple at one scale, but not another. Well, just for example, we have very complicated molecular motions, but relatively simple, at least at steady state, microscopic thermodynamic properties. So at the phenomenological thermodynamical level, things are relatively simple compared to what's going on underneath. Similarly, local molecular motions versus the intermediate scale molecular motions in generic cells, which have a larger structure, and in some ways are more simple than the individual motions. In fact, we can't calculate from the local molecular motions what the intermediate scale motions are. It's not a tractable problem. Now, for some particular interests, some scales are more appropriate than others. That doesn't mean that scale is arbitrary, though. If we have a particular interest, there will be particular scales that are useful to look at. That's not an arbitrary question. So the choice of scale isn't completely arbitrary. And we can make mistakes about the appropriate scale. I could give some examples, but they would take too long. The mistakes we can make can be due to external conditions interacting in complex ways with internal conditions. Whereas we might assume that the system has particular laws which are independent of the boundary conditions. The boundary conditions might not be fixed. So to choose a particular scale, we might miss the nature of the changing boundary conditions. But more often it's some combination of the two. It turns out that these problems appear specifically when we have complexly organized systems, especially those that are emergent. benefit from that reading. Getting back to complicated versus complex, complexity theory in some circles has come to mean something more than just complicated. The Santa Fe Institute is probably the best example of this. But there are other circles, like the New England Complex Systems Institute, where complexity just means complicated. And they tend to offer what I call simple solutions to complex problems. They say things like, a perspective that considers emergence is often contrasted with a reductionist perspective, with things about parts in isolation. Reductionism is often vilified, anti-complex systems view of the world. The context of a system is based upon a limited form of reductionism that distinguishes the system from its environment and the parts of the system from each other. The key difference is that a non-reductionist approach considers the relationships among them. That is completely and utterly trivial. Yeah. And that's what they put forward and charge people a lot of money for. I mean, this is why I put it up there, because it's so silly. Mathematical complexity. There are ways to measure complexity mathematically. Actually, what we're measuring here is complicatedness. It can be the minimal amount of information that it takes to describe something. And this can be formalized as algorithmic complexity, which is the length of the shortest self-delimiting program that can produce something structured. It's basically the amount of information. It does depend on the programming language, but that's negligible for really complicated things. And also, if you're comparing the complexity of different things, the programming language part drops out. And like I say, it really corresponds to complicatedness. Here's a little model of how it works. We have information in a structure. We ask 20 questions, a 20 questions sort of game, and we get answers of ones and zeros to the answer to the questions we ask, yes or no. And we just keep doing that until we exhaust all the things we could ask about this thing. It doesn't matter if some of the questions overlap, because what we do next is we use algorithmic information theory to compress the amount of information. So we get the amount of information that's in this in its shortest form. So there's a mathematics. It turns out this can't always be calculated, but it can for DNA, for example. It can for quite a few interesting things. But in principle, there's a finite amount of information in any system, and this can be defined. And we can make estimates. If we can't necessarily give the exact amount of information over a given system, we can make estimates using this model of how much information there is in a system, how much information there is in different systems. But like I say, for things like DNA, protein structures, we can calculate it exactly. Cliff Hooker and I distinguish 4 types of systems. Type 1, which are simple and low organization, planetary orbit, pendulous springs, sort of things you learn in the first year physics classes. They're type 2, they're complex with low organization. Ideal gas, perhaps macroeconomics, biological populations as are understood in biological population theory. They're type 3, which are simple with high organization, computer, military, Catholic Church, perhaps. And then finally there are type 4 systems, which are complex with high organization. And these would be living systems and minds would be primary examples here. And obviously these are the ones we're interested in when we're dealing with biological systems. They're organized complexity. Not just complicated, but they're organized complexity. Here's a little model here. We've got organization going in this direction and complexity going in this direction. This is a schematic. I wouldn't say these are scales, these are just directions. So what is organization? That's the next question. The basic idea is that an organized system is interconnected in complex ways so that there are both local and non-local effects, so that there are interactions at a close scale, but also there are interactions at a larger scale. The system can be strictly hierarchical in some cases. The higher levels can be the sum of the effects of the parts, or it could be the behavior of the parts is strictly controlled from above in some sense. This sort of systems are decomposable, and they're not, I would say, complexly organized. Complex organization involves neither summation nor top-down control, but shows an interaction of both bottom-up effects and top-down effects. So we can't fully separate it into top-down or bottom-up composition, but we have to work from both sides. And they can't be decomposed and then, like, atomistically put back together. There are ways to measure organization. One is logical depth due to Charles Bennett, the minimal computation time to produce the surface structure for a maximally compressed form. In other words, we have the information in the system. We want to produce the system. It's going to take a certain amount of computation effort to produce the surface structure from the bottom structure. The chairs in this room are fairly well organized, so it doesn't take a lot of computation time to calculate the organization of the chairs in the room from the amount of information that's required to describe their positions to begin with. There's another term called sophistication, is pseudo-outline. He calls this the number of logically simple steps required to produce a structure from its components. This is a more physical notion. He's a biologist. But you can see there's a similarity between these two. Exactly how they fit together, neither he nor I know. But I suspect they're closely related. And then finally, there's the notion of thermodynamic depth. This would be the minimal work required to produce a structure from its components. And again, this looks a little bit like Atlas sophistication, and also looks a little bit like logical depth. But it turns out there are some systems which Atlas pointed out are infinitely sophisticated. It require an infinite number of logically simple steps to put it together. That means you can't compute the surface structure from the structure of the components. Those are relationships, non-computable. Also, there are cases in Bennett's case where the minimum computation time or the minimum number of computational steps is infinite. These are non-computable surface structures, basically. So there's no way in principle to compute the surface structure from the component structures. It turns out Bernard cells are one of these things. It's a really simple case, but it turns out that Bernard cells can't be computed that way. But thermodynamic depth is different because obviously you can do a certain finite amount of work in order to produce a complex structure. So it turns out although the similarity between these amongst these is apparent, they're not really the same thing. And especially thermodynamic depth can't be the same thing. I guess so. this is a notion I introduced to deal with the species issue. Cohesion is a dynamical property that individuates something, whether a thing or a property, and it's grounded in the logical condition of identity. But it's going to be peculiar for each thing, so there's an empirical component to the notion. It requires dynamical closure, so we have a test of whether or not we've taken what we need into consideration by looking at the closure conditions. So the closure of the property of, say, you're probably aware that some birds will flap their wings like this as if it's broken when some predator approaches their nest, and they move away from the nest, and the predator sees, oh, there's an injured bird there, I'll go and chase after the injured bird. Now, what are the cohesion conditions for this property? Well, it's not for the benefit of the bird. You might say it's for the benefit of the eggs in the nest. That's not a bad idea, but actually it's a combination of the two. It's for the benefit of the lineage, and that's how it gets selected. So the cohesion property there, the cohesion of the property there, the closure conditions are for the lineage and not for any of the components. That's why looking at the closure conditions is important to see what the property is a property of. Okay, just relatively quickly. Identity is a fairly simple notion. It's an equivalence relation. It doesn't really help us because in individuation, because the identity of everything is the same. Identity is the same property for everything. So one of my professors, John Perry, came up with what he called the unity relation, and it holds amongst parts of things. If A and B are parts of A, then A, U, B, the unity relation, and B, U, A. So it's symmetric. It's also transitive. And by these two, it's an equivalence relation. So anything that holds a unity relationship, if you take the closure of that, then you'll have what unifies all the parts of the thing into the same thing. And the unity relationship of A, big A, will contain all and only the parts of A. It's a fairly simple logical notion, except that well, the unity of A for some things is completely nominal, like for sets. We just divide it in terms of its members. For some systems, this will apply as well. We can say a tree is a plant over 4 meters tall, so we get the unity for measure aspect for a tree will include being over 4 meters tall. But the unity of some things is natural. It has some empirical and testable aspect. An extreme case is a quartz crystal, whose parts and interactions have to be discovered. A dynamical system is a set of interacting components that's characterized and individuated by other systems by its dynamical interactions. And gold, what makes gold gold is atomic number 79. We know that now. People in the past didn't know that, but they were still talking about gold because it was this thing that had the atomic number 79. Why is this important? Well, it gives us a way of defining cohesion. If we assume dynamical realism, the view that everything is either dynamical, involves its forces or flows, or else can be understood in terms of dynamics, then in particular, all natural entities, objects, systems, properties, processes, are dynamical or abstractions from dynamical entities. Now, if we restrict ourselves to dynamical properties in the unity relation, then we get a dynamical unity relation, and that's just what I call cohesion. So this explains what cohesion is and why cohesion acts as an individuating property, because it's basically a unity relationship, which is an equivalence relationship, which tells us what it is to be a particular type, a particular thing. It gives us an identity conditions, essentially. It has some interesting characteristics. It comes in degrees, so we should expect intermediate cases. They can differ in strength in different dimensions, so we need a cohesion profile to individuate an object. Heart attacks are rare, but they can be fatal, for example. So they don't happen very often, but they can break up a person's cohesion. But it both unifies dynamical objects and dynamical objects. I could call this the dividing glue. So it's an effective criteria of individuation, but also being dynamical, it's testable. In fact, this is one of the advantages of dynamical realism, that it only allows things that we can actually interact with. There are none of these imaginary, virtual, whatever types of things that we can't interact with. But its real strength is the way it forces us to look at dynamical closure whenever we want to claim that something is individuated. And I mentioned the bird case. I think I'm going to skip through these because they're rather technical. Downward causation. I made this point briefly in a footnote in a paper in 1988 where I talked about downward causation, not seeming to get the ontology right. But it seems to me that downward causation is best explained in terms of cohesion. It is a large-scale property that confines the lower-level properties, it constrains them. So if you're familiar with Paul Humphrey's work, it's similar to Humphrey's fusion property. A natural hierarchy. Well, if it's natural, we're assuming dynamical realism, then hierarchies are formed by dynamical properties. They're not imaginary things. So any hierarchy has to have a hierarchy property that orders the hierarchy into levels. And the hierarchy property that has to exist at each level. Whatever it is that makes the hierarchy is going to have to apply across the levels. By dynamical realism, natural hierarchies must have a hierarchy property that's either dynamical or definable in dynamical terms. Dynamical hierarchies are determined by a part whole, where the parts and the wholes are each individuated by cohesion. So natural hierarchies are a cohesion hierarchy, basically. This is important. And the only point this makes is that I've noticed that there's a tendency to confuse class hierarchies with hierarchies in individual systems. And class hierarchies are abstractions. They may be grounded, the abstractions may be grounded in dynamical properties, but the real dynamical hierarchies are always going to apply to particular things, like, say, my body. Well, I might want to talk about the mental and the biological and the chemical and the physical. That's an abstraction. Mustn't be confused with the actual hierarchy that exists in the system.